The night was still, the air thick with the kind of quiet that presses down on you, making every breath feel like a betrayal. We stood at the edge of the old airstrip, a place long forgotten by everyone except for the locals who whispered its dark history. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows across the cracked tarmac, and the wind carried the faint scent of something old, something rotting. "I don't know about this, guys," whispered Emily, her voice trembling. She was the youngest in our group, always the first to suggest a horror movie, but the last to brave one alone. Her wide, fearful eyes darted from side to side as if expecting something to leap out from the darkness at any moment. "Don't be such a baby, Em," scoffed Josh, trying to sound brave, though his voice wavered. He kicked a loose pebble down the runway, the sound echoing in the stillness. "It's just an old airstrip. Nothing's here except a bunch of stories." Stories. That's all they were supposed to be, stories. But as I looked out at the long stretch of abandoned concrete, half consumed by weeds and time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something that went beyond the stories we'd heard as kids. My name is Daniel, and I've always been the sensible one, the one who keeps everyone grounded when things start to get out of hand. But that night, even I felt the icy fingers of fear creeping up my spine. There was something about the airstrip, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The night was wrong, the air was wrong, and I wanted nothing more than to turn around and leave. But then, curiosity got the better of me. That stupid, reckless curiosity that always seems to lure you in just when you should be running the other way. "Let's just check it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll look around, see if we can find anything interesting, and then we're out of here. No big deal." "Yeah, see? Danny's got the right idea," Josh chimed in, slapping me on the back like I just made a winning call in a game we both knew we shouldn't be playing. I shot him a look, but didn't say anything. Truth was, I wanted to prove I wasn't scared, that we could handle whatever was out there. But deep down, I knew we were stepping into something far bigger than any of us could understand. The old airstrip was supposed to be haunted, or so the legend went. Back in the 1940s, during the height of World War II, it had been a bustling military base. Planes roared overhead, soldiers marched in formation, and the air was thick with the smell of gasoline and the sound of engines roaring. But then something happened, something that no one could ever quite explain. The official reports were vague: an accident during a late-night mission, a fire that got out of control, a tragic loss of life. But the locals told a different story. They whispered of planes that never returned, of ghosts of pilots and soldiers wandering the runways, lost and confused, forever reliving the night they died. As we walked further into the darkness, the tall grass brushing against our legs, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The moonlight barely reached the cracked tarmac now, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Every step felt like a step too far, every breath like the last one before something terrible would happen. "Guys, maybe we should go back," Emily said again, her voice almost pleading now. But before anyone could answer, we heard it, a low, distant hum that made our blood run cold. It was coming from somewhere deep within the airstrip, a sound that shouldn't have been there, that shouldn't have existed in a place that had been abandoned for decades. "What the hell is that?" Josh asked, his voice suddenly small, his bravado gone. We all stopped, listening intently as the hum grew louder, closer. It was the unmistakable sound of an engine, but not just any engine. It was the sound of an old warplane, the kind that hadn't flown since the war ended. The kind that should have been nothing more than a memory, a ghost from a time long past. And yet, it was real, it was there, and it was getting closer. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the growing roar of the engine. But none of us moved. We were frozen in place, our eyes wide with fear, our minds struggling to process what was happening. Then, out of the darkness, a plane emerged, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It was flying low, too low, its wings cutting through the air like a knife. The sound was deafening now, a roar that shook the ground beneath our feet. The plane sped toward us, its engine screaming, its lights flickering like they were struggling to stay on. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The roar of the engine faded into the distance, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. We stood there in stunned silence, our hearts pounding in our chests, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. No one spoke. No one moved. We just stared at the spot where the plane had been, where the darkness had swallowed it whole. What the hell just happened? Josh finally managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. All I knew was that we had crossed a line, that we had awakened something that should have been left alone. And as I looked around at my friends, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear, I knew that this was just the beginning. The airstrip wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was angry, and it wasn't going to let us leave. The events of that night haunted us long after we left the airstrip. We tried to go back to our normal lives, to forget about the ghostly plane that had almost claimed us. But no matter how hard we tried, the memory lingered like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over everything we did. Josh stopped coming to school. He didn't answer our calls, didn't respond to our messages. It was like he had disappeared off the face of the earth. Emily, too, changed. She became quiet, withdrawn, her once bright personality dimmed by an invisible weight. As for me, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that plane coming toward us, its engines roaring, its lights flickering like the last breath of a dying man. I should have known better than to suggest we go back to the airstrip. But curiosity, that same reckless curiosity that had led us there in the first place, wouldn't let me rest. I needed to know what we had seen, what had really happened that night. And I knew that the answers were at the airstrip. It took me 2 weeks to convince Emily to come with me. Josh was a lost cause, but Emily, I knew she was just as curious as I was, even if she wouldn't admit it. "This is a bad idea, Daniel," she said as we stood at the edge of the airstrip once again, the same cold wind brushing against our skin. "We shouldn't be here." "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to know what's going on. We need to understand." She didn't say anything after that. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. The airstrip looked the same as it had that night, but there was something different about it now. Something that made my skin crawl. The air was thicker, the darkness deeper, and the silence. The silence was suffocating. We walked slowly, carefully, our footsteps barely making a sound on the cracked tarmac. The tall grass rustled around us, but it didn't hide the eerie quiet that pressed in from all sides. Do you think we'll see it again?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if we do, we need to be ready. We need to." My words were cut off by a sudden noise, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the same hum we had heard before, the low, distant sound of an engine coming to life. But this time, it was different. This time, it was closer, louder, and there was something else. Voice. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Voices of men shouting, yelling orders, their words lost in the roar of the engine. We froze, our eyes wide with fear, our bodies trembling. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like the engine was right on top of us, like the plane was about to appear out of the darkness and take us with it. But it didn't. Instead, the sound began to change, to morph into something else. The roar of the engine faded, replaced by the grinding of metal, the screech of something tearing apart. And the voices grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. "Maide! Maide! We're going down. We're going down." The words cut through the night like a knife, sharp and clear, filled with terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The air was silent once again, but the silence was different now. It was heavy, oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 souls pressing down on us. What the hell was that? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "But I think we just heard what happened that night." "The crash?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking. "But it didn't just happen once. It's happening again. Over and over." The realization hit us both at the same time. The airstrip wasn't just haunted by the ghosts of the past. It was a place where time itself had broken, where the past and the present were trapped in a never-ending loop of horror. And we were caught in the middle of it. We left the airstrip that night with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Something terrible had happened there, something that had left a scar on the very fabric of reality. And whatever it wasn't going to let us go until we understood it, until we uncovered the truth. But the truth was a slippery thing, hidden beneath layers of fear, lies, and half-remembered stories. The more we searched for answers, the more the shadows closed in around us, whispering secrets we weren't meant to know. Emily and I started spending all our time together, poring over old newspapers, interviewing locals, trying to piece together the puzzle of the abandoned airstrip. The deeper we dug, the more we uncovered, and the more terrifying the picture became. The airstrip had been built in a rush during the early days of World War II, a strategic location meant to support the war effort. But from the very beginning, things had gone wrong. Planes crashed during routine missions, pilots reported strange phenomena in the skies, and there were whispers of something dark, something evil lurking in the shadows. The official reports were sanitized, scrubbed clean of anything that couldn't be explained. But the local stories told a different tale. They spoke of ghost planes that appeared out of nowhere, of pilots who vanished without a trace, of men who returned from missions only to go mad, haunted by something they couldn't escape. The more we learned, the more the pieces began to fit together. The airstrip wasn't just haunted. It was cursed, a place where the line between the living and the dead had been shattered, where the past and the present had become tangled in a web of horror. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. One evening, as we sat in the dim light of Emily's living room, surrounded by old maps and faded photographs, she handed me a yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged and faded with age. "Where did you find this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "In my grandfather's attic," she replied, her eyes wide with fear. "He was stationed at the airstrip during the war. I never knew. I never knew he was part of it." I unfolded the letter carefully, my hands trembling. The words were hard to read, but the terror in them was unmistakable. They told us to fly. They told us to fight. But they didn't tell us about the ghosts. They didn't tell us that we were flying into hell itself. We see them now, every night, in the darkness, in the fog. They call to us, beg us to join them. We're trapped here, all of us, and we'll never escape. The airstrip. It's a tomb, a place where the dead walk among the living. And we're next. The letter ended abruptly, the last line trailing off into a smear of ink. I looked up at Emily, my heart pounding in my chest. "Your grandfather, what happened to him?" "He never talked about the war," she replied, her voice trembling. "He came back, but he was never the same. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, talking about the planes, about the men he saw. And then one day he just disappeared. They said he wandered off, lost his mind, but now I think he went back to the airstrip." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily's grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He had been drawn back to the airstrip, back to the place where the living and the dead were forever entwined. And now we were being drawn in too. The following days were a blur of fear and desperation. We couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but the airstrip and the horrors that awaited us there. But no matter how hard we tried to resist, we knew we couldn't stay away. Something was pulling us back, something that wouldn't let us go until we had uncovered the truth. We went back to the airstrip one last time, armed with everything we had learned. We knew it was dangerous, knew that we might not make it out alive. But we had to try. We had to understand what had happened, what had gone so horribly wrong all those years ago. The night was eerily quiet as we approached the airstrip, the same oppressive silence that had greeted us the first time. But now, there was something else, something that made the air hum with tension. It was like the airstrip was alive, aware of our presence, waiting for us to make the first move. We walked slowly, carefully, our footsteps barely making a sound on the cracked tarmac. The tall grass rustled around us, but it didn't hide the eerie quiet that pressed in from all sides. "Do you think they're here?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "But if they are, we need to be ready. We need to." Before I could finish, the ground beneath us began to shake. It was subtle at first, just a faint tremor, but it quickly grew into a full-blown earthquake, the tarmac cracking and splitting beneath our feet. We stumbled, struggling to keep our balance, as the ground shook violently. And then, out of the darkness, we heard it, the roar of engines, the same deafening sound that had haunted us for weeks. But this time, it was different. This time, the sound was everywhere, coming from all sides, as if the very air itself was alive with the roar of planes. We looked up, and there they were, a squadron of ghostly planes, their outlines barely visible in the darkness, their engines screaming as they flew low over the airstrip. They were old, World War II aerobombers, their bodies battered and scarred, their wings barely holding together. And in the cockpits we saw them, the pilots, their faces twisted in terror, their eyes wide with fear. They were trapped, caught in a never-ending loop of death, doomed to relive their final moments over and over again. "Daniel, look!" Emily cried, pointing to the ground. I followed her gaze and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, soldiers in tattered uniforms, their bodies broken and twisted, their faces pale and hollow. They were the lost men, the ones who had died on the airstrip all those years ago, their souls trapped in this cursed place. They walked toward us, their eyes empty, their movements slow and deliberate. They were reaching out, their hands grasping for something, for someone. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. But it was too late. The ground beneath us split open, a gaping chasm that seemed to reach down into the very depths of the earth. We stumbled, falling to our knees, as the ground crumbled beneath us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The planes disappeared, the soldiers faded into the shadows, and the airstrip was silent once again. We were alone, but the horror was far from over. The days that followed were a nightmare, a blur of fear and confusion. We had survived the airstrip, but we knew that we hadn't escaped. The curse had followed us home, its dark tendrils wrapping around our minds, our souls, pulling us deeper into the abyss. Josh was the first to succumb. He had been withdrawn quiet, ever since that night, but now he was worse. He barely spoke, barely ate, his eyes haunted by something only he could see. And then one day he was gone. His parents found his room empty, his bed undisturbed. The police searched, but there was no trace of him. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Emily was next. She had always been the strongest of us, the one who kept us grounded, but now she was unraveling. She started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision, whispers that no one else could hear. She became obsessed with the airstrip, convinced that we had to go back, that we had to finish what we had started. But I knew that going back would be the end of us. The airstrip was a tomb, a place where the dead walked among the living, and I wasn't ready to join them. Not yet. I tried to stay away, tried to ignore the pull of the curse, but it was no use. The airstrip was in my dreams, in my thoughts, a dark presence that I couldn't escape. And I knew that it was only a matter of time before I gave in, before I became just another ghost trapped in that cursed place. The final descent began on a cold, rainy night. I was alone in my room, staring out the window at the storm that raged outside. The rain lashed against the glass, the wind howling like a pack of wolves, but it wasn't the storm that I was afraid of. It was the sound of engines, the same roar that had haunted me since that night at the airstrip. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder, closer, until it felt like the planes were right outside my window. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the sound, but it was no use. The roar was inside my head now, a relentless noise that drowned out everything else. And then I heard them, the voices of the pilots, the same desperate, terrified voices that had echoed across the airstrip. "Mayday! Mayday! We're going down! We're going down!" The words cut through the storm, sharp and clear, and I knew that it was time. The airstrip was calling me, and I couldn't resist. I grabbed my coat and ran out into the night, the rain soaking through my clothes as I stumbled down the empty streets. The roar of the engines followed me, guiding me, pulling me toward the airstrip. By the time I arrived, the storm had reached its peak. The wind howled through the trees, the rain pouring down in sheets, but the airstrip was calm, eerily calm. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating, as if the night itself was alive, watching, waiting. I walked slowly, carefully, my footsteps barely making a sound on the cracked tarmac. The tall grass rustled around me, but it didn't hide the eerie quiet that pressed in from all sides. And then, out of the darkness, they appeared, the planes, their engines roaring, their lights flickering like dying stars. They flew low, too low, their wings slicing through the air like knives. And in the cockpits I saw them, the pilots, their faces twisted in terror, their eyes wide with fear. They were coming for me. I ran, but there was nowhere to go. The airstrip stretched out endlessly before me, the darkness closing in from all sides. The roar of the engines grew louder, deafening, as the planes descended, their lights blinding, their wings casting long dark shadows across the ground. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The planes disappeared, the roar of the engines faded into the distance, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. I was alone, standing in the middle of the airstrip, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I wasn't alone. Out of the shadows they came, the soldiers, the lost men, their bodies broken and twisted, their faces pale and hollow. They walked toward me, their eyes empty, their movements slow and deliberate. They were reaching out, their hands grasping for something, for someone. For me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, as the soldiers closed in, their hands cold and clammy as they grabbed hold of me. I screamed, but there was no sound, no escape. The darkness swallowed me whole, pulling me down into the abyss. And then there was nothing. The airstrip remains abandoned, a forgotten place where the past and present are forever entwined in a never-ending loop of horror. The locals still tell stories of the ghost planes, of the lost soldiers who wander the runways, searching for a way out. But no one goes there anymore. The airstrip is a tomb, a place where the dead walk among the living, and those who enter never leave. They become part of the endless night, trapped in a world where the past and the present collide, where the living and the dead are forever entwined. And so the airstrip waits, a silent witness to the horrors of the past, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it, to become part of its dark, twisted history. Waiting for you.